Wizards of the Coast have made some pretty questionable decisions about Magic the Gathering products, especially recently. This is a video about a questionable decision that they made a long time ago that most players probably don't know about. Starter sets. Magic the Gathering is a complex game. If this video showed up in your recommendations, you probably watched my Magic Rules iceberg, so you know how complex it can get. While this complexity is great for experienced players because it allows for a deeper level of strategy, it's understandable that it can be pretty intimidating for new players who want to get into the game. To help with this, for a while, Wizards classified sets in Magic into 3 levels, depending on their target audience. Regular sets aimed at established players were known as expert sets. Core sets aimed at intermediate players were known as advanced sets. And sets for brand new players were known as starter sets. These starter sets did a lot of interesting things, including a few things that eventually spread to Magic as a whole, but they also made some pretty baffling mistakes. There are a total of 5 starter sets released. The first 3 were the 3 Portal sets: Portal, Portal Second Age, and Portal 3 Kingdoms. These sets stripped the game down to its absolute basics. The only card types in the sets were creatures, sorceries, and basic lands. There were no artifacts, enchantments, instants, or non-basic lands. Well, when I say there were no instants, that's a half-truth. There were a handful of instants, but their type line still said sorcery. They just had text in their text box that explained that they could be played at times sorceries normally couldn't be played. The card layouts were slightly altered to be clearer, so all effect text was in bold, while reminder text and flavor text was in non-bold italic. Many of the cards also had reminder text for things that normally wouldn't get any reminder text, such as reminding players that Armageddon destroys its controller's lands too. And yes, they did put Armageddon in the starter set, 3 starter sets in fact, and a functional reprint in another. I have no idea what the hell they were thinking either. The cards had a horizontal line between effect text and flavor text to separate them and make it extra clear what's part of the effect and what's just flavor. Creatures also had a sword next to their power and a shield next to their toughness to help remind players which was which. Basic lands had no effect text at all and instead just had a large symbol of the mana type that they produced. This became the standard for all basic lands starting from 6th edition. Beyond these simplifications, the cards themselves were also very simple. Portal had far more vanilla creatures than a typical set, with only a few creatures having unique abilities, and sorceries generally having very simple effects as well. The first ever starter set, called Portal, was released in May of 1997. Cards in Portal used simplified wording that differed from regular Magic cards. For example, cards that target didn't use the word target, but instead said any one X. So any one creature instead of target creature, for example. Portal also used different terminology in place of normal Magic terms. The library was referred to as the deck, and the graveyard was referred to as the discard pile, using terminology more in line with traditional card games. Power and toughness were replaced with offense and defense, respectively, which was probably also more intuitive for new players. And for some inexplicable reason, they changed the term block to intercept. I've never understood why they thought this was a good idea. The other changes all at least make some sense, but it's not like block is a particularly confusing word. It really seems like they changed it just for the sake of changing it. Like, well, we're changing all these other words, we might as well change block as well. I'm genuinely surprised they didn't change the word tap. They could have changed it to something like exhaust or use or even turn or something like that. Tapping's far more confusing than blocking, but what do I know? While most of these terminology changes did help to make the game a bit easier, they also made it more difficult for players to transition into the real game. The next 2 Portal sets ditched most of these changes and generally went back to using regular Magic terminology. Another simplification found only in the first Portal set was the removal of creature types. Back when these sets came out, creatures didn't actually say creature on their type line. They said summon, followed by creature types. so summon goblin or summon elf or whatever. Portal simplified this just to summon creature for all creature types. The second Portal set was Portal Second Age, also just called Portal 2. It was released in June of 1998. It shared many similarities with the first Portal set. I don't really have a lot to say about it. It's probably the least interesting of the Portal sets. Still, there are a few notable things to mention about Portal Second Age. It was the first Magic set in which creature cards actually said creature on their type line. This became standard for all sets starting from 6th edition. The other thing I want to mention is its flavor. Portal 2 is the only Magic set to heavily feature firearms. Many creatures in the set are depicted using guns. This was somewhat controversial because it clashed with the traditional high fantasy style of previous Magic sets. It was also especially bad because the story took place on the plane of Dominaria, the plane where most of the Magic stories had taken place up until that point, and where guns had not appeared at all. While the guns themselves are pretty archaic looking and don't really disrupt the fantasy style, the fact that they're on an established plane that's never even hinted at them before is a pretty strange creative choice. I mean, it's not clear why they decided that the set had to take place on Dominaria rather than inventing a new plane. Still, it's no worse than Ursa piloting a mech. Guns have since appeared on a handful of other Magic cards, notably several pirates from the Ixalan block, but they've never featured as prominently as in Portal 2. The final Portal set, Portal 3 Kingdoms, was released in May of 1999. This is probably the most interesting of the three. The set was aimed almost exclusively towards the Asian market, specifically China and Japan. These two countries in particular are markets that Wizards would love to break into. China obviously is a massive market with a huge number of potential customers, so of course every company wants to sell their product there. And then of course there's Japan. Magic has always been fairly popular in Japan compared with many other countries, but locally produced card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon are even more popular, and Wizards of the Coast was hoping that Magic could take a larger chunk of the market share. The set was printed in Japanese, traditional Chinese, and simplified Chinese, as well as a very small print run in English, which was sold mostly in Australia and New Zealand. This limited print run makes the English versions of these cards among the rarest of all Magic cards in terms of number printed. The cards in the set are based on the famous Chinese historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was itself inspired by true events. There are many legendary creatures in the set, and the majority of them are named after real historical people. These are the only examples of Magic cards named after real people, apart from Richard Garfield PhD, which is from an unset so it doesn't count. Because this set is set in the real world, Magic doesn't really make sense, so the set includes many functional reprints of existing cards, with the flavor changed to make more sense in a setting without Magic. For example, Borrowing 100,000 Arrows is a functional reprint of Theft of Dreams, and Ravages of War is a functional reprint of Armageddon. Another weird result of this flavor choice is the only new mechanic added in the set, or any of the starter sets, horsemanship. Because the set is based in the real world, there aren't a lot of things that can reasonably have flying, especially because the majority of creatures in the set are humans. Instead of flying, Wizards created a new keyword called horsemanship, which is basically just renamed flying. Creatures with horsemanship can't be blocked by creatures without horsemanship. Obviously, from a flavor perspective, this represents soldiers on horseback outmaneuvering those on foot. When Portal cards were made legal for tournaments, more on that in a minute, Wizards had internal debates about whether to errata cards with horsemanship to have flying instead. While this obviously wouldn't make sense from a flavor perspective, it would arguably be better for gameplay. If this change wasn't made, creatures with horsemanship would be essentially unblockable, since so few other creatures exist with horsemanship. Their final decision was to just let the creatures keep horsemanship, since none of the creatures with horsemanship were considered powerful enough to pose a serious threat in non-rotating formats, even if they were functionally completely unblockable. Since then, none of the horsemanship creatures have seen any serious play at all. Interestingly, one tangentially horsemanship-related card has seen a decent amount of play in Commander, Rolling Earthquake, which was meant to be a functional reprint of Earthquake, dealing damage to each player and each creature without horsemanship, where Earthquake damages all players and all creatures without flying. Since there are only a few creatures in the game with horsemanship, and none of them are good enough to see much real play, Rolling Earthquake effectively damages all creatures, making it a decent sweeper for commander decks. It never saw a huge amount of play, but because of the extremely limited print run of the set, the card was over $200 for a while. It has since been reprinted, with the reprint available for only a few dollars. Several other cards in the set also reached ridiculous prices due to limited supply. Probably the most infamous of these is Imperial Seal. It's a strictly worse reprint of Vampiric Tutor, having an identical effect except that the seal is a sorcery, while the tutor is an instant. But Vampiric Tutor is restricted in Vintage, so Imperial Seal, which is also restricted, can function as a second copy in decks that want to run 2. And of course in Commander, where you can only play one of each card anyway, the seal is played for the same reason. Once again, because of how limited the print run was, this was enough to bring the price up to ridiculous levels. Imperial Seal did get reprinted once as a Judge promo, which was also printed in extremely limited quantities and did little to reduce the price. Until it was reprinted in Double Masters 2022, Imperial Seal was by far the most expensive non-reserved list card, and the original Portal 3 Kingdoms printing still commands a fairly hefty price. Indeed, the list of most expensive non-reserved list cards consists mostly of Portal 3 Kingdom cards. Many of them are not even good. Zodiac Dragon, for example, is awful, but it costs hundreds of dollars entirely because of its limited print run. The Portal sets were followed up by 2 more starter sets. The first, released in 1999, was simply called Starter, but it's now commonly known as Starter 1999 to distinguish it from its follow-up, which was called Starter 2000. Because of course it was. Everything made in the year 2000 was required to add 2000 to the end of its name. The cards in Starter 1999 were much more like those in regular Magic sets. Although they still used bold text to distinguish effect text, and separated flavor text with a horizontal line, creatures no longer had sword and shield icons next to their power and toughness, and the wordings used on the cards were identical to those used in regular Magic sets. The set even included a few instants that actually used the instant card type, although it still completely lacked artifacts, enchantments, and non-basic lands. The final starter set, Starter 2000, was quite unlike the other starter sets. The cards in this set were formatted exactly like regular Magic cards, without bold text for effects and with no line separating effect text from flavor text. The way that the set was sold was also quite different. While the other starter sets were available in booster packs, Starter 2000 was only available as a 2-player starter set. As you would expect, this set contained decks for 2 players. It also contained a so-called advanced pack for each deck. The advanced pack contained a predetermined selection of more complex cards, including instants, enchantments, and artifacts, as well as creatures with more complex abilities, that could be added to the decks after the players had mastered the basics of the game. As I previously hinted at, when these sets were released, the cards in them were not tournament legal, except for those that were reprints of existing cards, which were legal in any format that the originals were legal in. A few cards originally from the starter sets were later reprinted in tournament legal sets, which then made the starter versions tournament legal as well. Eventually, in 2005, Wizards announced that all cards from starter sets would be legal in Vintage and Legacy. The fact that these cards were not originally tournament legal is by far the most baffling thing about these sets. It's a truly stupid decision on Wizards of the Coast's part. I can only assume that the reasoning was that beginning players would not go to tournaments, so it wouldn't matter if the cards weren't tournament legal. But surely the ultimate goal of a starter set is to turn beginners into advanced players. And a big step in that process is getting them into smaller events like Friday Night Magic. Imagine being a new player, and you buy a starter set, and you play the game casually with your friends. After a while, you feel confident that you know how to play the game well enough, and you decide to go to your local game store and play some Magic. and they tell you that your cards are no good and you need to buy a completely new set of cards. I don't know about you, but that would for sure turn me off the game. I really cannot think of any reason why Wizards would decide this was a good idea. I mean, the cards aren't really strong enough to be competitive, so maybe they didn't want new players to go into a store with a starter set and get stomped by players with competitive decks. I think most people would be less likely to be turned off the game by being stomped in a tournament than by being told that they can't even play at all unless they buy an entirely new set of cards. Sure, they still have to buy the new cards if they want to be competitive, but it can be done in a much less aggressive way. Like, okay, my deck isn't very good, maybe I'll buy a few singles or a couple of booster packs and try to improve my deck, rather than, oh, I guess I'll just throw away all the cards I have and start over. I can only imagine how bad this must have felt at the time and how many potential fans they turned away with this choice. While starter sets no longer exist, Wizards have released many products since then that are aimed at getting new players into Magic. Wizards do appear to have learned from their mistake with starter sets, and they've always made sure that these introductory products are legal in Standard, so that new players can take them in to play Friday Night Magic, even if they have little chance of winning. Another lesson that Wizards learned was to make the cards in the introductory sets just like those in regular sets. As the starter sets went on, the cards in them became more and more like regular cards. While it might seem like a good idea to make a simplified version of the game for new players, that just ended up making it harder for them to transition into the regular game. Instead, newer introductory products simplify the game by including more vanilla creatures and using cards with simpler effects, while still formatting the cards the same as those in regular products. While starter sets were largely a failure, some of their less ridiculous changes were carried over to the regular game. As I mentioned, things like basic lands having a big mana symbol instead of effect text, and creatures actually saying creature on their type line instead of summon, were originally introduced in these sets, so it wasn't all bad. The expert and advanced ratings continued to appear on the packaging of regular sets and core sets until 2007, long after starter sets had been phased out. I know I always wondered back in the day what made these sets expert sets, and if you've ever wondered about that, then now you know.